Hello everyone. Before we begin today's story, I have a small favor to ask. Please hit subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you never miss our channel's new videos. It's quick, free, and the best way to support us in bringing you more dramatic stories. Your support means the world to us. Where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. Thank you very much. Mark walked through the massive gates of Eleanor Brooks' estate, his heart racing with a mixture of nervousness and disbelief. The mansion loomed ahead, an imposing structure of old stone and towering columns, a symbol of wealth and power. Mark felt like an intruder as his cab made its way up the long driveway, the crunch of gravel beneath the tires echoing in the stillness of the estate. He had never seen anything like this before. The house was beautiful, but cold, almost like a museum, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. As the cab came to a stop, Eleanor was waiting at the door, her tall figure framed by the grand entrance. She gave him a brief nod, her expression unreadable. "Welcome, Mr. Davis," she said in her usual cool, formal tone. Her voice had a polished quality to it, as though she were speaking to a business partner rather than her new husband. Mark stepped out of the cab, feeling the weight of the decision he had made the day before. It felt unreal, as if he were walking in someone else's shoes. "You'll find your room inside. The staff will take care of your things," Eleanor continued, turning toward the door. Mark followed her into the mansion, taking in the grandeur of the space around him. The walls were adorned with priceless art, and the floors gleamed with polished marble. It was everything he had imagined wealth to be: old, impersonal, and vast. As they walked through the hallways, Mark tried to steady his nerves. He had agreed to this arrangement out of desperation, to save his family from the crushing debt his father had left behind. But now, standing in this opulent mansion, it was starting to feel like he had made a mistake. Eleanor led him to a large, elegant dining room where a staff member was already setting the table. "Dinner will be served shortly," she said, dismissing the staff member with a wave of her hand. "I trust you'll find everything to your liking. If you need anything, don't hesitate to ask." Mark nodded, but his mind was elsewhere. He had never been this close to such wealth before. Everything was so perfect. Too perfect. Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes steadying him for a moment before speaking again. "I know this may be a lot to take in. I don't expect you to be comfortable here right away, but I believe we can make this arrangement work for both of us. We'll keep up appearances, attend events, and maintain the public image of a married couple. The rest is up to you." Mark could feel the weight of her words pressing down on him. He had no idea how he was supposed to play the role of a husband, especially to someone like Eleanor. Her cold, calculated demeanor was a stark contrast to his own anxiety and uncertainty. The thought of spending every day in this house, playing the part of a husband, felt overwhelming. As the night wore on, they sat down to dinner, a meal fit for royalty. The food was exquisite, but Mark could barely taste it. His mind kept wandering back to his family, the debts they faced, his mother's illness, and the weight of this strange, contract-based marriage. Eleanor didn't seem bothered by the silence, continuing to eat with a quiet grace that Mark could only envy. As they finished the meal, Eleanor stood up and turned to him. "You'll find your room prepared for the night," she said. "We'll meet again tomorrow morning. There are a few things we need to discuss regarding your role in this marriage." Mark stood, feeling an uneasy knot in his stomach. He had agreed to this arrangement for the sake of his family, but now that he was here, in this mansion, with this woman, everything felt more real than he had anticipated. As Eleanor led him to his room, the door closed behind him with a soft click. The room was elegant, with antique furniture, a four-poster bed, and large windows that overlooked the manicured gardens. It was beautiful, but it felt cold and empty. Mark sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the reflection of himself in the mirror. He was a husband now, but not in the way he had ever imagined. There was no love here, no warmth. Just a business arrangement. A contract. He couldn't help but wonder if he had made the right choice. Was this really the way to save his family, or had he just signed away his soul? The morning after his first night in Eleanor's mansion, Mark woke up with a sense of unease hanging over him. He sat up in the plush bed, staring at the high ceilings and the large windows that let in soft rays of sunlight. Everything in this house was designed to impress, yet Mark still felt like an outsider. The room was immaculate, every detail perfect, but it felt more like a display than a home. He sighed, running a hand through his hair. This wasn't how he had imagined his life would turn out. He had agreed to this arrangement to protect his family, to save them from the financial mess his father had left behind, but now, in the quiet of the morning, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was in too deep. As he stood up and got dressed in the clothes Eleanor had provided for him, he couldn't help but wonder what his next step would be. He had no idea what his role in this arrangement truly was. Eleanor had been clear about the public expectations: attend events together, act like a couple in front of others, but beyond that, there was nothing personal, nothing real. He felt like a puppet, and Eleanor was the one pulling the strings. The house felt even colder as he walked down the hall to the grand dining room. Eleanor was already seated at the table, her posture perfect, her expression composed. She didn't look up when he entered, just continued sipping her coffee as if he were a part of the furniture. "Good morning," Mark said, trying to sound casual, though the words felt strange in his mouth. Eleanor nodded slightly, her gaze finally lifting to meet his. "Good morning," she replied, her tone polite but distant. "I trust you slept well." "I did, thank you," Mark said, though he knew it wasn't entirely true. His mind had been racing all night, filled with thoughts of the future, of his family, and of the decision he had made. "I'm glad," Eleanor said, setting her cup down with a soft clink. "Today, we need to discuss your role in this arrangement. As you know, this is not a traditional marriage. We have certain expectations that need to be met." Mark sat down across from her, feeling the weight of her words. He had known this would be a business arrangement, but hearing it again, so plainly, made it feel even more real. "I understand," he said, his voice steady despite the turmoil in his chest. "What exactly do you need me to do?" Eleanor didn't hesitate, her gaze unwavering. "We will attend events together, gala dinners, charity functions, and business meetings. You will be by my side at all times, and we will present ourselves as a married couple. No one outside of this house needs to know that this is anything other than what it appears to be. Do you understand?" Mark nodded. He had no problem with the public appearances. That was the easy part. It was the rest of it, the part he couldn't yet see, that worried him. "Yes, I understand," he replied. Eleanor studied him for a moment, as though measuring his sincerity. "Good. There will be no personal involvement beyond what is necessary. This is a partnership, Mark. Nothing more." Mark could feel the distance in her words. She was so calm, so composed, like this was just another business transaction for her. For him, it was different. This was his life. "And what happens after the events? When the cameras are gone, when we're no longer in the spotlight?" he asked. Eleanor leaned back in her chair, her fingers lightly tapping on the edge of her cup. "Then, we go back to our separate lives. You are free to do as you please. But while we're together in public, you will act as my husband." Mark wasn't sure how he felt about that. He had never signed up for a relationship of this kind, cold, businesslike, and completely devoid of emotion. But he couldn't afford to back out now. His family needed him to follow through. "Understood," he said, his voice firm. "And the rest of it, the personal part?" Eleanor's eyes softened, just slightly. "There is no personal part, Mark. Not for me. Not for you. We both have our lives to lead. This is simply a means to an end." Mark didn't know what to make of that. He had never been part of a marriage like this. He couldn't help but wonder what it would take for him to feel like he truly belonged here. Would he ever stop feeling like a stranger in this mansion? Would he ever be able to look at Eleanor and see something more than just a business partner? The day continued in a blur of meetings and plans, the two of them navigating the strict boundaries they had set. They attended a charity event later that evening, and as they walked into the ballroom, Mark couldn't help but notice the way people watched them. They were the perfect couple in the eyes of the world, elegant, poised, and utterly composed. But behind the smiles and handshakes, Mark could feel the distance between them. He was playing a role, and Eleanor was, too. But what if this game they were playing, this contract they had signed, began to feel too real? The following morning, Mark woke up to the same sense of unease that had plagued him the night before. He stood up from the bed, stretching, but the luxury of the mansion felt colder than ever. Despite the wealth surrounding him, the pristine furniture, and the high ceilings, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he didn't belong here. He had agreed to this arrangement to help his family, but every moment felt more like a trap. He knew he had no choice but to play along, but it was becoming harder to ignore the growing emptiness he felt inside. After a quick breakfast alone, Eleanor appeared as usual, dressed in a sharp, formal suit, her expression unreadable. She barely acknowledged him as she sat down across from him. "Today, we have a few meetings to attend. We need to maintain our public image," Eleanor said, her voice steady and emotionless. Mark nodded, trying to hide his growing frustration. He had thought he could handle this arrangement, but the more time he spent with Eleanor, the more it felt like he was living a lie. They had become nothing more than actors, playing roles in a performance neither of them seemed to want. The day passed in a blur of meetings, charity events, and business dinners, where Mark and Eleanor were the picture of the perfect couple, polite, poised, and utterly detached. The people around them seemed to admire them, complimenting their chemistry and partnership, but Mark could barely muster the energy to smile. Every moment with Eleanor felt like a reminder of how distant they truly were from each other. As they made their way back to the mansion that evening, Mark couldn't help but feel drained. The night was cold, and the mansion felt even colder. He followed Eleanor into the large living room, the flickering light from the fireplace casting long shadows on the walls. She moved with grace, her posture perfect, but there was something in her eyes that Mark couldn't quite read. "You're quiet tonight," Eleanor remarked, her tone neutral. "Is something bothering you?" Mark hesitated, unsure of how to respond. He could feel the weight of her gaze on him, but he didn't want to admit the truth that he was beginning to feel like a stranger in his own life. "I'm fine," he finally said, forcing a smile. Eleanor didn't press further, but Mark could tell she wasn't convinced. She sat down in one of the plush chairs by the fire and gestured for him to join her. Mark took a seat across from her, the space between them feeling more significant than ever. The silence between them stretched on for several minutes, broken only by the crackling of the fire. Finally, Eleanor spoke. "You're doing well," she said, her voice calm. "You've adapted quickly to your role, and I appreciate that. But remember, this is still a business arrangement. Nothing more." Mark met her eyes, feeling a mixture of frustration and confusion. He had known from the start that this was never going to be a real marriage, but he hadn't expected it to feel so empty. "I understand," he replied, though part of him wanted to say more. He wanted to ask her why she had agreed to this, why she had chosen him of all people. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the same coldness in her eyes that kept him from asking the questions that burned in his mind. "Good," Eleanor said, her lips curling into a faint smile. "Just remember, this is temporary. Once the arrangement is complete, we both move on. No attachments." The finality in her words hung in the air. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper was at play, that there was more to Eleanor than she was letting on. But for now, he had no choice but to play his part. As the evening wore on, Eleanor retreated to her study, and Mark found himself alone in the vast mansion. He walked aimlessly through the empty halls, his footsteps echoing in the silence. He had agreed to this contract, but now, with each passing day, he wondered if he had made a mistake. He had entered this arrangement to save his family, but he couldn't help but feel like he was losing himself in the process. The life he had imagined for himself, one filled with love, purpose, and connection, seemed more and more distant. He stopped in front of a large mirror in the hallway, staring at his reflection. He barely recognized the man staring back at him. He had changed, but he wasn't sure if it was for the better. Mark turned away from the mirror and walked to the window. The moon was full, casting a soft glow over the garden outside. He thought about his mother, about the debt that still hung over their heads, and about the promise he had made to her. He had to keep going. He couldn't give up now. But the longer he stayed in this mansion, the more he wondered if he had sacrificed something far more important than money in the process. The following morning, Mark stood by the large window in the mansion, watching the sunrise break over the horizon. The golden light poured through the tall windows, casting long shadows across the room, but it did nothing to ease the weight he felt in his chest. It had been several weeks since he had agreed to this arrangement with Eleanor, and despite the outward appearance of their partnership, Mark still felt like an outsider in his own life. The mansion, with its grand architecture and cold, impersonal luxury, only made him feel more isolated. He had followed the rules attending events, pretending to be the loving husband Eleanor expected him to be, but inside, he was beginning to crack. Eleanor had been clear from the start this was a business arrangement, nothing more. But the more time Mark spent with her, the more he wondered if she believed that herself. She was always so composed, so in control, but every now and then, he caught a glimpse of something behind her eyes. Something that hinted at a deeper pain or longing. He couldn't quite place it, but he knew there was more to her than the cold, calculating woman she portrayed. That night, they attended another high-profile charity gala. The ballroom was filled with the city's elite, and once again, Mark found himself walking beside Eleanor, playing the part of the perfect couple. As they mingled with other guests, exchanging pleasantries and smiling for the cameras, Mark's mind wandered. The crowd was so full of superficial conversations, people exchanging compliments and shallow words, but there was no real connection. He glanced at Eleanor, who was talking to a group of donors, her face a picture of poise and elegance. He couldn't help but wonder if she ever felt the same emptiness he did. After the event, they returned to the mansion, both exhausted but keeping up the appearance of a successful couple. As they entered the grand foyer, Eleanor spoke. "You did well tonight," she said, her voice cool but not unkind. "You played your part perfectly." Mark nodded, his words tight. "Thank you." Eleanor paused and turned to face him. "I know this isn't easy for you." "It's not easy for me, either." The sincerity in her voice caught him off guard. It was the first time she had acknowledged the strain of their arrangement. He looked at her, trying to find some sign of vulnerability, but she quickly masked it with her usual composure. "We both have our reasons for this," she continued. "But remember, this is temporary. Once everything is settled, we go our separate ways." Mark swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "I understand." But did he? Did he truly understand what he was getting himself into? He had come into this arrangement hoping for a quick solution to his family's financial troubles, but now, as each day passed, he realized how much he was losing in the process. He was losing himself. And, though he hated to admit it, he was beginning to care about Eleanor. It wasn't love, knew that. But there was something about her, something that made him want to know more, to understand her better. Over the next few days, Mark found himself in a constant internal struggle. He was trapped in a marriage with no love, no warmth, just a cold, transactional agreement. But as he spent more time with Eleanor, he couldn't help but notice the small things, the way she always looked out the window when she thought no one was watching, the slight tremor in her voice when she spoke of her past, the way she would always be the first to leave a room when the conversation turned personal. It made him wonder, was she just as lonely as he was? Did she, too, feel like she was playing a part in a life that wasn't truly hers? One evening, as they sat in the living room after another long day of events, Mark finally asked, "Eleanor, why did you do this? Why agree to this arrangement?" Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her face unreadable. For a brief second, Mark thought she might say something real, but then she looked away, her gaze shifting to the fireplace. "I told you," she said softly, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's a business arrangement. Nothing more." But Mark wasn't convinced. There was something in the way she said it that made him think there was more to the story. He wanted to ask more, to push for the truth, but something told him it wasn't the right time. Instead, he simply nodded and turned his attention to the fire. They sat in silence, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the room. Mark's thoughts raced, and he couldn't shake the feeling that he was getting caught in something far deeper than he had ever intended. The arrangement had started out simple, just a contract, a way to fix his family's financial troubles. But now, as he spent more time with Eleanor, he couldn't help but wonder if there was more at stake than just money. Was it possible that in the midst of all this emptiness, he had started to find something that resembled connection? The next few days passed in a blur of public appearances, events, and charity galas, all designed to keep up the appearance of their perfect marriage. Eleanor and Mark, though still polite to each other, moved through these events like strangers playing a role. Eleanor remained as composed and distant as ever, and Mark, despite his growing confusion about his feelings, did his best to keep up with the act. They barely exchanged more than a few words when alone, and Mark couldn't help but feel the chasm between them grow wider with each passing day. But one evening, as they were walking back from another exhausting gala, something changed. The cold air of the night wrapped around them, and the silence between them seemed heavier than usual. Eleanor, usually so composed, spoke first. "You've been quiet lately," she said, her voice softer than Mark was used to. He glanced at her, surprised by the break in her usual detachment. "I've just been thinking," he said, his voice low. "About everything. This whole arrangement. I don't think I fully understood what it would be like." Eleanor didn't respond immediately. Instead, she continued walking, her eyes fixed ahead. But Mark could sense a shift in her demeanor. He had seen that same tension in her before, like she was holding something back, something deeper than the business arrangement they had agreed upon. Finally, Eleanor stopped walking and turned to face him, her expression unreadable. "I never wanted this to be more than it is," she said quietly. "I didn't want to complicate things. I wanted a solution, not this." Mark felt his chest tighten. "You're not the only one," he said, looking away. "I agreed to this because I thought it was the only way to save my family. But somewhere along the way, I've started to lose sight of why I'm here." Eleanor's eyes softened, just for a moment. "I know," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's not easy. But sometimes, we have to do what's necessary." Mark stood there, frozen for a moment. He had never seen her like this. There was something raw in her voice, something he hadn't expected to hear. It made him question everything. Was she really as cold and calculating as she appeared? Or was she just as trapped in this arrangement as he was? He wanted to ask her, to push for the truth, but something held him back. Instead, he nodded. "I just wish it could be different," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Eleanor didn't reply. She just turned and continued walking toward the mansion. Mark followed her, the weight of their words hanging in the air between them. That night, as they returned to the mansion, the silence felt more suffocating than ever. Eleanor went to her study, and Mark found himself alone in the grand foyer. He stood there for a moment, staring at the intricate design of the marble floors, but his mind was elsewhere. The conversation with Eleanor had left him shaken. He had never expected to find any real connection in this arrangement, but the more he spent time with her, the more he realized how much he was beginning to care. It wasn't love, not yet, but there was something there. Something that made him want to break through the walls she had built around herself. As the night stretched on, Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was on the edge of something he didn't fully understand. He had entered this arrangement with clear goals in mind: to save his family, to escape the crushing debt his father had left behind. But now, as he lived in this house with Eleanor, he felt like he was losing something far more important than money. He was losing himself. And for the first time since agreeing to the marriage, Mark wasn't sure if the cost of his decision was worth it. He lay in bed that night, staring up at the ceiling, the quiet of the mansion pressing in on him. Eleanor's words lingered in his mind, her admission that she didn't want to complicate things, but wasn't that what had already happened? The more they played this role of husband and wife, the more they blurred the lines between what was real and what was a performance. And Mark wasn't sure how much longer he could keep pretending. As the days passed, Mark tried to push his feelings aside. He focused on the events, on keeping up the appearance of their marriage for the sake of their public image. But inside, he knew things were changing. He couldn't ignore the connection that was slowly forming between him and Eleanor, no matter how much he tried. The more time he spent with her, the more he wanted to break through the barriers she had built. But he wasn't sure if she was even capable of letting someone in. And as much as he wanted to be the one to make her see that she deserved more than this cold, transactional life, he wasn't sure if he had the strength to do it. He had already sacrificed so much. Could he risk everything for the chance of something real? The next few days unfolded in a blur of business meetings, charity galas, and social events. Eleanor and Mark continued to play the perfect couple, their smiles practiced, their conversations polite but distant. Mark had come to expect the emptiness that came with these interactions, but something inside him began to shift. He couldn't shake the thought that there was more to Eleanor than the cold, calculating businesswoman she portrayed. One evening, after another tiring event, Mark found himself alone in the mansion's expansive living room. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, casting long shadows on the walls. He sat in one of the plush armchairs, trying to relax, but his thoughts kept returning to Eleanor. It had been days since their conversation about their arrangement, and despite the fleeting vulnerability she had shown, things had not changed between them. She remained as emotionally distant as ever, burying herself in her work while Mark struggled with his growing feelings. He couldn't help but wonder if he was the only one affected by their time together. He glanced toward the hallway, wondering where Eleanor was. She had been quiet all evening, retreating to her study after dinner, as she often did. Mark sighed, his hand resting on the armrest. He felt trapped. This wasn't how he had imagined his life would be. He had agreed to this marriage for one reason only: to save his family from the financial mess his father had left behind. But now, as each day passed, he realized that his personal life was slipping through his fingers. He had come to know Eleanor in ways he hadn't expected. She wasn't the ruthless businesswoman he had assumed. He had seen glimpses of the woman beneath the mask, the one who cared about something more than just money and power. But every time he thought he might break through her walls, she built them back up even higher. Mark shook his head, pushing those thoughts away. He couldn't afford to get distracted. But despite his best efforts, Eleanor was always in his mind. And the more he tried to ignore his feelings, the more intense they became. The following evening, Mark found himself once again walking beside Eleanor at another high-profile event. This time, they were at a corporate gala, filled with powerful businesspeople and celebrities. As they mingled with guests, Mark felt a knot form in his stomach. The artificial nature of the evening, the fake smiles and empty conversations, was wearing on him. Eleanor seemed unaffected, her smile flawless as she exchanged pleasantries with colleagues. But Mark couldn't shake the feeling that something was missing. It was the same emptiness that had followed him since he first agreed to this arrangement. As the night wore on, Eleanor pulled Mark aside. "You've been distant tonight," she said, her voice low, barely audible over the noise of the crowd. Mark hesitated, unsure how to respond. "I'm fine," he said, offering a forced smile. "Just tired." Eleanor studied him for a moment, her gaze sharp and perceptive. "Are you sure?" she asked, her voice softening. "This isn't easy for either of us, but we have a role to play." Mark looked into her eyes, searching for any sign of the person he had glimpsed before, the one who wasn't just playing a part. But all he saw was the same calm, composed woman, her mask firmly in place. "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I'm just trying to make sense of all this." Eleanor's expression softened ever so slightly. She placed a hand on his arm, her touch light but firm. "I understand," she said, her voice quiet but steady. "But remember, this is temporary. We do what we have to do, and then, we move on." Her words hit Mark harder than he expected. Temporary. That was all this was supposed to be. But as he stood there, staring into her eyes, he couldn't help but feel that they were both lying to themselves. He had never imagined that a marriage like this could feel so complicated, so emotionally charged. He had agreed to this for a reason, but now, with every passing day, that reason seemed less clear. He had started this to save his family, but he was beginning to wonder if he was losing himself in the process. Eleanor turned to leave, but Mark stopped her. "Eleanor," he said, his voice tight with emotion. She looked back at him, her expression unreadable. "What is it?" she asked, her tone neutral. "Do you ever think about us?" he asked, unsure of how to phrase the question. Eleanor blinked, clearly caught off guard. For a brief moment, Mark thought she might say anything, but then her mask slipped back into place. "There is no us," she replied softly, her eyes darkening. "There never was. This is business. Nothing more." Mark's heart sank as she turned away, disappearing into the crowd. The weight of her words hung heavily in the air, and for the first time since agreeing to this arrangement, Mark felt completely and utterly alone. The next few days were filled with the same routine events, dinners, and public appearances. Eleanor and Mark continued to maintain their perfect facade, exchanging polite words and smiles when necessary, but remaining emotionally distant from each other. Mark couldn't shake the feeling that he was losing himself in this charade. He had entered into this arrangement with clear intentions to save his family, to escape the suffocating debt left by his father, but now, it seemed like he was paying a higher price than he had imagined. His feelings for Eleanor had grown, despite his best efforts to suppress them. He couldn't stop thinking about her, about the vulnerability he had glimpsed in her during their brief moments of honesty. But each time he tried to reach out, to get closer, she pulled away, burying herself in the role of the businesswoman who had no time for emotions. He knew what she had said: their marriage was temporary, a business arrangement, nothing more, but the more time they spent together, the harder it became to believe that. Mark's thoughts were interrupted when Eleanor appeared in the hallway, dressed impeccably as always. She was holding a document in her hands, her face as composed as ever. "We need to talk," she said, her voice calm and direct. Mark nodded, though he couldn't hide the feeling of unease that settled in his stomach. They made their way to the living room, where the soft glow of the lamps cast shadows on the walls. Eleanor sat down on the plush sofa, motioning for him to join her. "What is it?" Mark asked, his voice tinged with a mixture of curiosity and apprehension. "It's time we take this to the next step," Eleanor said, her gaze steady. "The deal is almost complete. We've done our part, attended the events, played the role. Now, we can both move on." Mark sat back, his heart racing. He had known this day would come, the moment when everything would be over. But hearing it from her, in such a matter-of-fact tone, made him feel like a pawn in a game he didn't fully understand. "What happens next?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Eleanor's lips twitched into a faint smile, though it didn't reach her eyes. "We sign the final documents. The contracts will be settled. And then, we go our separate ways. You'll be free to return to your life. And I'll go back to mine." Mark felt a lump form in his throat. Was this really all it was? A contract? A business transaction? He had thought there was something more between them, even if it was just a flicker of connection, a brief moment of understanding. But now, as Eleanor spoke so coldly about the end of it all, he realized just how naive he had been. "And what about you?" he asked, his voice cracking slightly. "What do you want from all of this?" Eleanor's gaze softened for the briefest of moments, but it was gone almost as quickly as it appeared. "I want to be free, Mark," she said quietly. "Free from the obligations, free from the weight of expectations. I never wanted any of this to begin with." Mark's heart sank as he listened to her words. He had thought that maybe, just maybe, there was something more to their arrangement than just business. But now, he could see the truth. Eleanor had never wanted this any more than he did. It had been a necessity for both of them, nothing more. Mark stood up, walking to the large window that overlooked the estate. The view was stunning, but it only reminded him of how trapped he felt. He had come here to escape his past, to fix his family's future, but now, standing in this grand mansion, he realized that he was no closer to finding happiness. Eleanor had given him what he needed: financial security, stability, but it had come at the cost of his own sense of self. He had allowed himself to be pulled into a world of luxury and appearances, and in doing so, he had lost sight of who he truly was. Eleanor stood up and walked over to him, her steps soft against the marble floors. "You don't have to pretend anymore, Mark," she said quietly. "It's over. This was never supposed to be real." Mark turned to face her, his eyes meeting hers for the first time in days. There was no anger in her expression, no bitterness, just resignation. It was as if she had already let go of everything that had once mattered to her. And in that moment, Mark realized something. He wasn't ready to let go. He wasn't ready to walk away from this, from the connection they had formed, however fleeting it may have been. "I'm not ready to be done with this," he said, his voice strong despite the uncertainty he felt. Eleanor looked at him for a long moment, her expression unreadable. For a brief second, Mark thought she might say something, that she might admit that there was more to their story than just business. But instead, she turned away, her gaze falling to the floor. "You don't have a choice," she said softly. "We both made our decisions." Mark stood there, frozen, as Eleanor walked out of the room. The door closed behind her with a soft click, leaving Mark alone with his thoughts. He had thought that he could walk away from this arrangement, that he could accept it as just another chapter in his life. But now, standing in the quiet of the mansion, he realized that he wasn't ready to let go of something that had begun to mean more to him than he had ever expected. Mark stood still in the quiet, empty room, the soft click of the door echoing in his mind. He could feel the weight of Eleanor's words pressing on him, but he wasn't ready to accept them. He couldn't just walk away. Not yet. He had tried to convince himself that this marriage, this arrangement, was nothing more than a business transaction. But deep down, he knew it was more than that. It had become something else, something he wasn't ready to let go of. After a few moments of silence, Mark walked over to the window once more, looking out at the vast grounds of the mansion. The night was clear, the stars glittering in the sky, but the view only served to remind him of how small he felt in this world. He had started this journey with a single purpose: saving his family. But now, he realized that he had lost sight of his own path. The life he had imagined for himself seemed so far away, a distant memory fading with each passing day in this grand, cold house. He wasn't sure if he had made the right decision, but what he knew for sure was that he couldn't leave things this way. He couldn't let Eleanor walk away from him, not without a fight. He had already lost so much: his sense of self, his connection to his past, and he wasn't going to lose the one thing that had started to feel real. Eleanor. Mark walked down the hallway, his footsteps quiet but determined. He had to talk to her, to tell her how he felt. He had to find out if there was any chance at all that they could make this work. When he reached the study, the door was slightly ajar. Eleanor was sitting at her desk, her back to him, her fingers lightly tapping on the surface of the desk. She didn't hear him approach, and for a moment, Mark stood there, unsure of how to begin. Finally, he spoke. "Eleanor," he said, his voice low but steady. She turned in her chair, her expression unreadable. "What is it, Mark?" she asked, her voice calm, but there was a flicker of something in her eyes. Something that Mark couldn't quite place. "I know you said it's over," Mark continued, taking a step closer. "But I can't just walk away from this. From you." Eleanor's face softened for a brief moment, but she quickly masked it again, the walls going back up. "You don't understand," she said quietly. "This was never meant to be anything real." "I know," Mark said, his voice breaking slightly. "But it feels real to me. I've started to care about you, Eleanor. More than I ever thought I would." There was a long silence between them, and Mark could feel the tension in the room. Eleanor stood up, walking toward the window, her back still to him. "I didn't want this to happen," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't want to care either, but it happened anyway." Mark took a deep breath, closing the distance between them. "So what do we do now?" he asked, his voice pleading. "We can't just pretend it never happened." Eleanor turned to face him, her eyes searching his face, as if trying to find the right words. "I don't know," she said softly, her voice filled with uncertainty. "I never planned for this. I didn't think anyone would ever get close enough to make me feel something again." Mark stepped closer, his heart pounding in his chest. "Maybe that's what we need," he said, reaching out and gently taking her hand. "Maybe we need to stop pretending and see where this goes. For once, let's not be afraid of what could happen." Eleanor didn't pull away, and for a moment, they just stood there, holding each other's gaze. The walls between them seemed to crumble, piece by piece, until there was nothing left but the two of them. In that moment, Mark realized something. This wasn't just about saving his family anymore. It was about finding something real, something worth holding onto, even in the face of uncertainty. Slowly, Eleanor squeezed his hand, her expression softening. "Maybe you're right," she said quietly. "Maybe we need to take a chance." And for the first time in what felt like forever, Mark allowed himself to hope. He didn't know what the future held, or where this unexpected connection would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he wasn't afraid. They had both started this journey out of necessity, but now, they were walking it together. And maybe, just maybe, that was enough.